In the quiet hours of the night, when the modern world slowly fades into silence, history has a way of resurfacing. Not as dates or facts, but as stories. Stories that were once whispered by firelight, carved into stone, or pressed into wet clay by hands long turned to dust. Among the oldest of these stories are those of the Anunnaki, beings described in the earliest written records of human civilization. Their names emerge from the ancient land of Sumer, a world that existed more than 5,000 years ago, where rivers shaped kingdoms and gods walked closely beside humanity. Even today, these ancient figures continue to provoke fascination, speculation, and controversy. And for centuries, institutions built on religious authority have had to decide how such stories should be treated, remembered, or forgotten. The Anunnaki first appear in Sumerian mythology as a group of divine beings connected to the ordering of the cosmos. Their name, often translated as offspring of An, refers to their association with Anu, the sky god. In the oldest surviving texts, the Anunnaki are not monsters, nor invaders, nor hidden rulers of mankind. They are gods, deeply embedded in a mythological worldview that sought to explain creation, nature, kingship, and divine authority. These texts were never meant to be read as history in the modern sense. They were sacred narratives, poetic explanations of a universe that felt unpredictable and overwhelming to early humans. Yet, thousands of years later, these same texts would be rediscovered, translated, and reinterpreted in a world dominated by monotheistic religion. And it is here, in the long shadow cast by Christianity and its central authority in Rome, that tension quietly begins to form. Not because the Vatican ever officially declared fear of the Anunnaki as literal beings, but because ancient alternative creation stories posed a deeper challenge. They reminded humanity that long before one god ruled the heavens, many gods once shared them. To understand why this mattered, we must step into the mindset of early Christianity. The Christian faith did not emerge in a vacuum. It arose in a world already filled with gods, myths, and cosmologies. From the Roman pantheon to the mysteries of Egypt and the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia, people already believed they understood where the world came from and who ruled it. Christianity, in order to survive and expand, needed to establish not only belief, but exclusivity. One God, one creation story, one ultimate truth. This process took centuries. Early church leaders debated fiercely over doctrine, scripture, and authority. Councils were held, texts were chosen, edited, or excluded. Other writings, sometimes labelled heretical, were copied less often, hidden away, or lost entirely. This was not always done out of malice, but out of necessity. A religion built on unity could not afford endless competing narratives about the origins of humanity and the structure of the cosmos. Ancient Mesopotamian myths, including those involving the Anunnaki, described a world where humans were created for a purpose tied to the gods. In some texts, humanity exists to serve divine needs, to maintain temples, or to uphold cosmic order. While these ideas differ greatly from later interpretations that portray the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings, they still conflicted with the Christian belief that humans were created uniquely in the image of God, with an eternal soul and a divinely ordained destiny. For medieval scholars working under the authority of the Church, such differences mattered deeply. Knowledge was power, and interpretation was control. If alternative creation myths gained influence, they risked undermining the theological foundation upon which Christian authority rested. The Bible was not simply a religious text. It was the framework through which society understood morality, law, hierarchy, and purpose. Any competing narrative, especially one rooted in antiquity, had the potential to weaken that framework. It is important to be historically precise here. The Vatican did not hunt the Anunnaki. There was no official decree condemning them as real beings. The fear, if it can be called that, was not of ancient gods rising again, but of ideas resurfacing. Ideas that suggested humanity had once told very different stories about itself. Stories that implied the world had been explained in many ways before Christianity offered its own answer. As ancient texts were slowly rediscovered, particularly during the Renaissance, and later through archaeological discoveries in the 19th century, the Church found itself in a delicate position. Scholars began translating cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia. Names like Enlil, Enki, and Inanna entered academic discussion. These discoveries did not immediately threaten Christian belief, but they complicated it. They revealed that sophisticated civilizations had asked profound questions about creation, morality, and divine authority long before the Bible was written. For the faithful, this raised uncomfortable questions. If ancient people believed in many gods, and those gods governed the same natural forces described in biblical texts, what did that say about divine revelation? Was truth revealed once, or many times? And who had the authority to decide which version was correct? The Vatican, as an institution, has always understood the power of narrative. Throughout history, it carefully guided theological interpretation, emphasizing continuity between the Old Testament and Christian doctrine while distancing itself from pagan traditions. Ancient gods were often reclassified as myths, symbols, or at times even demons, not because they were feared as real rivals, but because their stories represented competing explanations of reality. Over time, popular imagination blurred the line between ancient myth and modern speculation. In the 20th century, writers outside mainstream scholarship began to reinterpret the Anunnaki through the lens of science fiction and alternative history. They proposed that these gods were not symbolic beings, but advanced extraterrestrials who engineered humanity. These ideas, while captivating, are not supported by credible historical or archaeological evidence. Ancient texts do not describe spacecraft, advanced technology, or genetic engineering in any literal sense. They describe gods using the language and symbolism of their time. Yet the persistence of these interpretations reveals something important about the human mind. We are drawn to hidden truths. We are fascinated by the idea that history conceals secrets deliberately kept from us. The Vatican, with its vast archives and long history of secrecy, becomes an easy focal point for such suspicions. Silence is often mistaken for concealment and caution for fear. In reality, the Church's relationship with ancient mythology is more complex. Many Catholic scholars study ancient religions openly. The Vatican museums display artifacts from pagan civilizations. The existence of the Anunnaki as mythological figures is not denied. What is carefully avoided is granting them theological significance within Christian belief. To do so would blur boundaries that have been maintained for nearly 2,000 years. As night deepens and the world grows still, it becomes easier to see these stories not as threats, but as echoes. The Anunnaki do not haunt history as forbidden beings. They linger as reminders that humanity has always searched for meaning, always looked to the heavens for answers, and always told stories to make sense of its place in the universe. This video does not claim that the Vatican hides proof of ancient gods, nor that the Anunnaki were something other than what ancient people believed them to be. Instead, it invites you to gently explore why certain stories were preserved, while others faded into obscurity, why some myths became scripture, and others became footnotes. And why, even today, the oldest gods ever written down still feel strangely powerful in the quiet moments before sleep. As we move deeper into this journey, we will return to the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, examine what they truly say, and slowly unravel how myth, belief, and authority have shaped human history. For now, allow the ancient world to settle softly into your thoughts, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a story to be remembered. To understand why the Anunnaki became such powerful figures in later imagination, it is necessary to return fully to their original world. Not the modern world of speculation and reinterpretation, but the ancient landscapes of Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This region, often called the cradle of civilization, produced humanity's earliest known writing system. Long before history was recorded on parchment or paper, it was pressed into clay with reed styluses, creating texts meant to endure. Within these tablets, the Anunnaki appear not as secrets, but as openly revered gods, woven into the fabric of daily life. In Sumerian belief, the universe was structured and hierarchical. The heavens, the earth, and the underworld were each governed by divine forces. At the highest level stood An, the sky god, embodiment of authority and cosmic order. From him came the Anunnaki, a collective of gods whose roles varied across time and city-states. Their identities were not fixed in a single canon. Mythology in Mesopotamia evolved continuously, shaped by political power, cultural exchange, and centuries of reinterpretation. Some texts describe the Anunnaki as judges of the underworld, deciding the fate of souls. Others place them among the great gods who controlled natural forces and human destiny. Enlil, god of wind and authority, was often portrayed as a chief among them. Enki, associated with water, wisdom and creation, appears as a benefactor of humanity, offering guidance and protection. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, embodied love, fertility, power, and war, reflecting the complexity of human emotion itself. These gods were not distant abstractions. They were intensely personal to the people who worshipped them. The Anunnaki were never described as a single unified group with one purpose. Instead, they represented a divine council, mirroring the political assemblies of early city-states. Just as kings ruled alongside advisors and officials, the gods governed collectively, each responsible for specific domains. This structure made sense to ancient societies, whose survival depended on cooperation, hierarchy, and balance. The cosmos was imagined as an extension of human civilization, ordered but fragile, divine yet unpredictable. Crucially, the ancient texts do not present the Anunnaki as creators of humanity in the modern conspiratorial sense. Some myths describe humans being fashioned from clay, mixed with divine essence, but these stories were symbolic explanations of labour, mortality, and obligation. Humans existed to serve the gods, to maintain temples, to offer sacrifices, and to uphold cosmic harmony. Life was not portrayed as a gift of unconditional love, but as a duty within a divinely ordered system. This worldview contrasts sharply with later monotheistic beliefs. In Christianity, creation is an act of singular divine will, motivated by purpose and meaning. Humanity is placed at the centre of God's plan, endowed with moral responsibility and spiritual value. Mesopotamian mythology, by contrast, reflects a world where humans are vulnerable, dependent, and often at the mercy of divine moods. Floods, droughts, and disease were not moral judgments, but expressions of divine imbalance. As Mesopotamian cultures evolved, so did their myths. The Akkadians, Babylonians and Assyrians inherited Sumerian traditions and adapted them. Names changed, roles shifted, gods merged or rose in prominence depending on political dominance. The Anunnaki remained present, but their portrayal was fluid. This flexibility is important to understand, because it reveals that these myths were never intended as immutable truth. They were living narratives shaped by human experience. When these ancient civilizations declined, their gods faded from worship. Temples fell into ruin. Clay tablets were buried beneath sand and debris. For centuries, the Anunnaki were forgotten entirely, their names unreadable, their stories silent. It was only in the modern era, with the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century, that their voices returned. Scholars painstakingly translated thousands of tablets, reconstructing a lost world piece by piece. This rediscovery was not dramatic in its time. It occurred quietly in academic circles, museums and universities. The texts were studied as mythology, history and literature. No serious historian viewed them as literal accounts of advanced beings or hidden technologies. They were recognized as expressions of early human thought, remarkable for their age, but firmly rooted in symbolic language. However, once these texts entered popular awareness, they took on new meaning. Outside the careful boundaries of scholarship, interpretations began to drift. Ancient metaphors were read literally. Divine descriptions were reframed through modern concepts of science and space travel. The Anunnaki, once gods of wind, water and authority, were transformed into visitors from the stars. This shift did not originate in ancient sources, but in modern imagination. It reflects less about Mesopotamia and more about contemporary society. In an age shaped by rapid technological advancement and exploration of space, ancient gods were imagined to fit modern fears and hopes. The unknown heavens of antiquity became outer space. Divine power became advanced technology. Myth became misunderstood history. From the perspective of religious institutions, this reinterpretation introduced a new layer of tension, not because the original myths were dangerous, but because distorted versions of them began to circulate as alternative explanations of human origins. The Anunnaki were no longer simply ancient gods. They became symbols of suppressed knowledge, challenging established narratives not with theology, but with pseudoscience. This is where the idea of fear often enters the discussion. Not fear of the Anunnaki themselves, but fear of confusion. Fear that symbolic stories would be misrepresented as factual history. Fear that myth would be weaponized against belief. Institutions like the Vatican have long prioritized clarity of doctrine, precisely because ambiguity can erode faith. Historically, the Church has responded to such challenges by reinforcing interpretation rather than engaging speculation. Ancient myths are acknowledged as part of human history, but firmly categorized as pre-Christian belief systems. They are studied, not venerated, preserved, but not elevated. This approach is not unique to Christianity. Every dominant worldview must define its boundaries. When viewed calmly and without sensationalism, the Anunnaki pose no threat to religious belief. They represent a stage in humanity's intellectual development, a time when the world was explained through divine personalities rather than natural laws. They are mirrors of early society, reflecting its fears, values, and hopes. Yet their endurance in modern storytelling reveals something timeless. Humans are drawn to origins. We want to know where we came from, who shaped us, and whether there is more to our story than we have been told. The Anunnaki endure not because they were hidden, but because they were unforgettable. They were among the first answers humanity ever gave itself. As you listen, allow these ancient gods to remain where they belong, not in secret chambers or forbidden archives, but in the shared memory of human imagination. In the next part of this journey, we will explore how Christianity encountered the remnants of these ancient belief systems, and how old gods were transformed, reinterpreted, or erased as a new religious order reshaped the world. For now, let the rivers of Mesopotamia flow gently through your thoughts, carrying with them the voices of a distant age, speaking softly of gods who once ruled the heavens, not as enemies of faith, but as ancestors of belief itself. As the ancient world slowly transformed, so too did its gods. Civilizations rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, and belief systems shifted with the tides of power. By the time Christianity began to spread across the Mediterranean world, the old gods of Mesopotamia had long ceased to be worshipped. Their temples stood abandoned, their rituals forgotten. Yet their ideas did not vanish entirely. They lingered beneath the surface of culture, embedded in stories, symbols, and inherited worldviews. And it was these lingering echoes that early Christianity had to confront. Christianity emerged in a world already saturated with religion. The Roman Empire tolerated many gods, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their traditions as long as they did not threaten imperial authority. Faith was plural, flexible, and deeply local. Christianity, however, introduced something radically different. It demanded exclusivity. One God, one truth, one path to salvation. This was not merely a theological position, but a revolutionary idea that challenged the foundations of ancient society. As Christianity spread, it encountered the remnants of older cosmologies everywhere. Pagan festivals marked the calendar. Temples dominated city skylines. Myths explained the cycles of nature and the origins of kingship. For Christianity to take root, it had to reinterpret this world, rather than erase it entirely. Old symbols were given new meanings. Pagan holidays were transformed into Christian celebrations. Sacred spaces were repurposed. This process was gradual, was strategic, and deeply human. Ancient gods were not simply dismissed as fiction. In many cases, they were reclassified. Some were reduced to mere myths, cultural curiosities of a less enlightened age. Others were reframed as demons or false idols, dangerous not because they existed, but because belief in them diverted souls away from the true God. This redefinition allowed Christianity to explain the persistence of pagan belief without granting it legitimacy. In this context, ancient creation myths became particularly sensitive. Stories of gods shaping humanity, arguing among themselves, or ruling through divine councils stood in contrast to the biblical narrative of a singular, omnipotent creator. The Christian God did not share authority. He did not consult a council. He spoke, and creation obeyed. Any story suggesting otherwise had to be carefully controlled. Early church scholars were deeply aware of this tension. Many of them were educated in classical philosophy and familiar with pagan literature. They did not deny the existence of ancient myths, but they argued that such stories represented humanity's flawed attempts to understand divine truth before proper revelation. Pagan gods were not rivals to God, but misunderstandings of him. This framework allowed Christianity to absorb the past without being threatened by it. The old gods became shadows of truth, distorted reflections of divine reality. In this way, ancient mythologies were neutralized, not through destruction, but through reinterpretation. They were acknowledged as part of human history, but firmly placed outside the realm of salvation. As Christianity gained political power, particularly after becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, this process intensified. Laws were passed against pagan worship. Temples were closed or converted. Public rituals honouring ancient gods were discouraged or outlawed. The goal was not historical erasure, but spiritual redirection. Society was to be reoriented toward a single divine authority. This transformation was not uniform or immediate. In rural areas, older beliefs persisted for generations. Folk traditions blended pagan and Christian elements, creating hybrid practices that survived quietly beneath official doctrine. Even today, traces of ancient belief remain embedded in cultural customs, seasonal celebrations, and symbolic language. For the Church, managing this transition required careful balance. Too much tolerance risked diluting doctrine. Too much force risked resistance. The solution was education and narrative control. Scripture was read aloud. Sermons explained the dangers of false gods. Art depicted pagan deities as defeated or powerless. Over time, the old cosmologies faded from everyday consciousness. The Anunnaki, however, occupied a unique position. Unlike the gods of Greece or Rome, they were not part of the cultural memory of medieval Europe. Their stories had been buried long before Christianity arrived. As a result, they were not directly addressed by early theologians. They were neither condemned nor debated. They were simply unknown. This absence would later become significant. When Mesopotamian texts were rediscovered centuries later, they reintroduced a pantheon untouched by Christian reinterpretation. These gods had not been reshaped into saints or demons. They had not been absorbed into folklore. They arrived as strangers from a forgotten world, their stories unfiltered by centuries of theological commentary. For institutions grounded in doctrinal continuity, such rediscoveries required caution. Ancient texts had to be contextualized carefully, studied academically, and prevented from being misused. The danger was not that people would return to worship ancient gods, but that modern audiences would misread symbolic narratives as literal alternatives to established belief. Thus, Christianity's relationship with ancient cosmologies has always been one of containment rather than confrontation. Old gods are allowed to exist as historical artifacts, but not as competing truths. Their stories are framed as human attempts to understand the divine, valuable for insight into the past, but incomplete and superseded. As the night deepens, it becomes clear that the story is not one of fear, but of transformation. The rise of Christianity did not destroy ancient myths entirely. It reshaped the world in which those myths could be remembered. Some were absorbed, some were forgotten, some waited silently beneath the earth, until time and curiosity brought them back into the light. In the next part of this journey, we will step into the medieval world, where knowledge itself became something to guard, preserve, and sometimes restrict. A world of monasteries, manuscripts, and carefully copied texts. A world where the past survived not in temples, but in libraries, and where the control of knowledge became inseparable from power. For now, let your thoughts drift through this long transition, from many gods to one, from myth to doctrine, from open belief to guarded truth. History moves slowly, and as it does, it carries old stories with it, softened by time, waiting to be remembered once more. As Christianity settled into its role as the dominant spiritual authority of Europe, belief became inseparable from structure. Faith was no longer only a matter of personal devotion, but the foundation upon which law, education, and social order rested. At the centre of this system stood the Church, and eventually the institution that would become known as the Vatican. Its influence extended far beyond theology. It shaped how history was recorded, how knowledge was preserved, and how truth itself was defined. In a world where literacy was rare, control over written texts meant control over collective memory. Monasteries became centres of learning, where monks carefully copied manuscripts by hand. Each word mattered. Errors could alter meaning. Unapproved ideas could spread quietly, carried from one manuscript to the next. As a result, the preservation of knowledge was accompanied by vigilance. Not everything was copied. Not everything was encouraged. Selection was inevitable. This does not mean that the Church feared knowledge in itself. On the contrary, many of the most educated minds of the medieval world were theologians, philosophers, and clerics. They studied Aristotle, Plato, and early natural science. They debated logic, ethics, and metaphysics. But knowledge was expected to serve faith, not undermine it. When new or rediscovered ideas challenged established doctrine, they were approached with caution. Alternative creation narratives were among the most sensitive topics. The biblical account of creation was not merely symbolic. It underpinned humanity's understanding of purpose, morality, and divine authority. To suggest that humanity's origins could be explained differently risked destabilizing this framework. Even when ancient myths were clearly non-Christian, their existence raised uncomfortable questions about universality and revelation. The Vatican's role, both real and perceived, became associated with guardianship. Doctrine had to remain coherent across vast regions and generations. Heresy, defined as belief that contradicted official teaching, was not treated as harmless disagreement. It was seen as a threat to unity, capable of fracturing communities and undermining social stability. This explains the intensity with which theological boundaries were enforced. During the Middle Ages, this enforcement took many forms. Councils defined doctrine, writings were evaluated, certain texts were discouraged or banned. Others were preserved only within restricted scholarly circles. This process was not unique to Christianity. Every dominant ideology in history has regulated competing ideas. What makes the Church distinctive is the scale and longevity of its influence. The Anunnaki, again, were not directly targeted. Their stories were still buried beneath the ruins of Mesopotamia. But the principle that governed their later reception was already firmly established. Ancient belief systems could be studied, but only as historical artifacts. They could not be allowed to challenge the theological narrative of creation, fall, and redemption. As centuries passed, the Church developed extensive archives, documents, letters, theological debates, and historical records accumulated behind stone walls. Over time, these archives acquired an aura of secrecy. In reality, much of this restriction was practical. Fragile manuscripts required protection. Sensitive correspondence demanded discretion. Yet secrecy invites speculation, and the idea of hidden truths took hold in the popular imagination. When archaeology began to uncover ancient civilizations in the modern era, this imagination intensified. The Vatican, already associated with authority and silence, became the focal point of suspicion. If ancient texts contradicted biblical narratives, some assumed they must be hidden. If alternative stories existed, they must be suppressed. The absence of public engagement was interpreted as fear. Historically, this interpretation oversimplifies a complex reality. The Church did not deny the existence of ancient myths. It simply refused to grant them theological authority. Mesopotamian creation stories were not debated in councils because they were not seen as relevant to salvation. They belong to a world before Christian revelation, and therefore outside its spiritual jurisdiction. Nevertheless, the rediscovery of ancient texts required careful framing. Scholars associated with the Church often emphasized the symbolic nature of pagan myths, contrasting them with the moral and spiritual clarity of Christian scripture. This approach allowed history to be acknowledged without doctrine being compromised. From a human perspective, this careful boundary setting can appear defensive, but from an institutional perspective, it was preservation. Belief systems endure only if they maintain internal coherence. Too many competing explanations of existence can fracture faith into uncertainty. Over time, the Vatican became a symbol of this guardianship. Whether fairly or not, it came to represent the idea that some knowledge was too dangerous for widespread consumption. In reality, what was considered dangerous was not the past itself, but misinterpretation of it. Symbols mistaken for facts. Metaphors treated as literal truth. The Anunnaki, when reintroduced to public awareness, became entangled in this dynamic. Ancient gods, once understood as mythological representations, were reimagined as hidden rulers or creators. This reinterpretation did not come from historical evidence, but from modern narratives shaped by distrust of authority. Yet institutions like the Vatican operate slowly, deliberately, and conservatively. Change is measured in centuries, not decades. Engagement with speculative interpretations offers little benefit and significant risk. Silence in such cases is not fear, but restraint. As you listen, it may help to shift perspective. Rather than imagining a powerful institution trembling before ancient gods, consider the quieter reality. An organization built on continuity choosing stability over speculation. A guardian of belief refusing to legitimize narratives that blur the line between myth and history. In the next part of this journey, we will enter the medieval mind more deeply. We will explore how scholars encountered fragments of ancient knowledge, how translation itself became an act of power, and how forgotten worlds survived quietly in manuscripts, waiting for the moment when the past would speak again. For now, allow these thoughts to settle gently. The Vatican's silence is not an echo of fear, but a reflection of caution. And in that stillness, the ancient stories remain, not locked away, but resting patiently in the long memory of human history. In the medieval world, knowledge moved slowly. Books were rare, fragile, and precious. A single manuscript could take months, sometimes years, to copy by hand. Ink was mixed carefully. Parchment was prepared from animal skin. Words were written with deliberate care, knowing that mistakes might endure for generations. In this environment, learning was not only an intellectual pursuit, but an act of responsibility. What was written mattered, and what was copied mattered even more. Monasteries became the quiet guardians of the past. Within their stone walls, monks preserved texts from antiquity, often without fully agreeing with their contents. Greek philosophy, Roman history, and the fragments of pre-Christian thought survived not because they were celebrated, but because they were studied. The medieval scholar approached ancient knowledge with caution, guided by the belief that truth existed, but must be handled carefully. Translation played a crucial role in this process. Ancient texts were not simply converted word for word, they were interpreted. Choices were made. Meanings were shaped by the worldview of the translator. A pagan god might become a metaphor. A mythological event might be reframed as allegory. Through translation, ancient ideas were softened, reshaped, and made compatible with Christian understanding. This was especially true when texts touched on cosmology, creation, or divine hierarchy. Medieval scholars were aware that earlier civilizations had imagined the universe differently. They knew of Plato's demiurge, Aristotle's unmoved mover, and fragments of Near Eastern myth preserved indirectly through later sources. What they lacked, however, was direct access to the original Mesopotamian texts. The Anunnaki remained silent, buried beneath layers of earth, unknown to the scholars who guarded Europe's libraries. Yet the concept of forbidden knowledge still emerged. Not all texts were suitable for all readers. Some ideas were considered spiritually dangerous if encountered without proper guidance. This belief was not rooted in fear of knowledge itself, but in fear of misunderstanding. A symbol misunderstood could become heresy. A metaphor taken literally could lead a soul astray. As a result, access to certain writings was restricted. Libraries were not open to the public. Education was structured and hierarchical. Learning progressed step by step, under supervision. This system ensured continuity, but it also created an atmosphere where knowledge appeared hidden, even when it was simply protected. Over time, stories grew around this protection. Whispers of lost books, hidden teachings, and suppressed truths circulated beyond monastery walls. The idea that powerful institutions concealed dangerous knowledge became part of cultural imagination. In reality, much of what was preserved was mundane: letters, sermons, legal documents, and theological debates. But mystery thrives in silence, and absence invites speculation. When ancient texts began to resurface during the later medieval period and into the Renaissance, they were greeted with both excitement and anxiety. The rediscovery of classical philosophy challenged existing interpretations of the world. New questions emerged about nature, reason, and humanity's place in creation. Each rediscovered idea required careful integration into an established framework of belief. This period revealed the Church's true concern: not ancient gods, but uncontrolled interpretation. Knowledge, once released, cannot be easily guided. Ideas take on lives of their own. A creation myth, read without context, could be misused to challenge doctrine. A symbolic story could be mistaken for literal truth. Thus, scholars were encouraged to approach ancient material critically, emphasizing its historical and cultural distance from Christian revelation. The past was acknowledged, but kept at arm's length. Ancient civilizations were admired for their achievements, but their beliefs were framed as incomplete steps toward fuller understanding. This cautious approach would later shape the response to the rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts. When the Anunnaki finally re-entered human awareness, they did so in a world already conditioned to view ancient belief systems as symbolic rather than factual. Yet outside academic and theological circles, this context was often lost. For the average observer, the idea that ancient gods had been forgotten, hidden, or ignored felt suspicious. Why were these stories not taught widely? Why did they seem absent from familiar history? The answer lay not in deliberate suppression, but in the simple reality of loss. Civilizations fall. Languages die. Knowledge disappears unless someone makes the effort to preserve it. The medieval church preserved what it could, within the limits of its understanding and priorities. It did not erase the Anunnaki. It never encountered them. Their absence was not a choice, but a consequence of time. As the night continues, it becomes clear that fear is too simple a word. The relationship between power and knowledge is not driven by panic, but by caution. Institutions endure by controlling pace, context, and interpretation. In doing so, they create both stability and mystery. In the next part of this journey, we will move forward into the modern age, when ancient clay tablets were finally unearthed, translated, and introduced to the world. A moment when forgotten gods returned, not through worship, but through scholarship, and when old myths were suddenly forced to share space with modern belief. For now, let these quiet centuries pass gently in your mind. Imagine the slow scratching of quills on parchment, the dim glow of candlelight in stone libraries, and the steady hands that carried fragments of the past forward through time, unaware of how powerful those fragments would one day seem. The modern age did not rediscover the ancient world all at once. It emerged slowly, through dust-covered ruins, broken stones, and fragments of writing whose meaning had been lost for thousands of years. In the 19th century, explorers and scholars working in the lands of Mesopotamia began to uncover something extraordinary. Beneath the soil lay the remains of cities older than any known from classical history, walls inscribed with strange wedge-shaped symbols, clay tablets hardened by time, evidence of civilizations that had flourished long before Greece or Rome. At first, these discoveries were silent. The symbols meant nothing. They were catalogued, preserved, and studied without understanding. Only later, through years of patient work, did scholars begin to decipher cuneiform writing. As the language slowly yielded its secrets, the voices of ancient Mesopotamia returned. Names appeared. Stories unfolded. Gods long forgotten were spoken once more. Among them were the Anunnaki. For historians, this was not a revelation that shook belief, but a remarkable expansion of knowledge. The texts revealed complex societies with laws, literature, astronomy, and theology. They showed that human civilization was far older and more sophisticated than previously imagined. Creation myths, flood stories, hymns and prayers emerged, offering insight into how early humans understood their world. One particular discovery captured public attention more than others. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its story of a great flood, seemed to echo the biblical account of Noah. For some, this parallel was troubling. For others, it was fascinating. It suggested that stories central to the Bible existed in some form long before Christianity. Scholars explain these similarities as shared cultural memory, shaped by the geography and experiences of ancient peoples. Floods were real. Rivers overflowed. Stories endured. Within academic circles, such explanations were accepted calmly, but beyond them, curiosity took a different path. The public imagination seized upon these ancient texts, not as mythology, but as potential evidence of forgotten truths. The idea that ancient civilizations possessed knowledge beyond their time began to take hold. By the 20th century, alternative interpretations emerged. Writers outside mainstream scholarship proposed that ancient gods were not symbolic, but literal beings. The Anunnaki, they claimed, were visitors from another world. Advanced, powerful, responsible for shaping humanity itself. These ideas borrowed selectively from ancient texts, stripping them of cultural context and reshaping them through modern concepts of technology and space travel. It is important to be clear. No credible evidence supports these claims. The ancient tablets do not describe machines, spacecraft, or genetic experiments. They speak in metaphor, ritual, and mythic language. What modern readers interpret as advanced technology is, in reality, poetic symbolism. Thunder becomes divine voice. The sky becomes a realm of gods. Creation becomes an act of shaping clay. Yet these speculative interpretations spread widely. They appealed to a growing distrust of institutions and a desire to believe that history concealed something extraordinary. In this environment, the Vatican was often portrayed as a silent witness, accused of knowing more than it revealed. The rediscovery of the Anunnaki was framed not as scholarship, but as exposure. From the perspective of religious institutions, this trend posed a subtle challenge. Not because ancient texts threatened doctrine, but because misinformation blurred the line between history and fiction. Myth, once understood as symbolic, was being rebranded as literal alternative history. This confusion did not require confrontation. It required patience. The Vatican, like many academic and religious institutions, responded through restraint. Scholars continued their work. Museums displayed artifacts. Universities taught ancient history. There was no dramatic rebuttal, no official condemnation of speculative theories. Silence, once again, was mistaken for fear. In truth, the Church has long acknowledged the existence of ancient mythologies. It has never claimed that the Bible was written in isolation from human history. What it maintains is theological meaning, not historical exclusivity. Ancient creation stories are seen as expressions of humanity's early attempts to understand existence, not as rivals to revelation. As technology advanced and information spread faster than ever before, the Anunnaki took on new life in popular culture. They appeared in documentaries, books, and online discussions. Each retelling moved further from the original texts. Complexity was replaced by certainty, ambiguity by assertion. This transformation says more about the modern world than the ancient one. In a time of uncertainty, people seek origins that feel grand, hidden, and meaningful. The idea that humanity was shaped by beings greater than itself is not new. It is one of the oldest themes in human storytelling. The Anunnaki simply became a modern vessel for that desire. For institutions built on continuity, responding to such narratives directly offers little benefit. Debate lends legitimacy. Silence preserves boundaries. The ancient gods remain where they have always belonged, within the study of history and mythology, not as actors in modern reality. As the night deepens, the story slows. The rediscovery of the Anunnaki did not unlock forbidden knowledge. It expanded understanding. It reminded humanity that it has always asked the same questions, even as the answers changed. Where did we come from? Who shaped the world? What lies beyond the visible sky? In the next part of this journey, we will turn our attention fully to the Vatican itself, to its archives, its reputation for secrecy, and the myths that surround it. We will explore why silence is so often mistaken for concealment, and how the idea of hidden knowledge became inseparable from one of the world's oldest institutions. For now, allow the ancient tablets to rest again in your thoughts. Their words have been read, their meanings explored, and like the civilizations that created them, they settle back into the quiet flow of history, neither feared nor forgotten, but understood. Few institutions in human history have inspired as much curiosity as the Vatican. Its walls are ancient, its rituals deliberate, its language measured and precise. For centuries, it has stood not only as a religious centre, but as a symbol of continuity in a world of constant change. This very continuity has given rise to a powerful myth, that behind its doors lie secrets capable of reshaping history itself. At the heart of this myth are the Vatican archives. Often imagined as a vault of forbidden knowledge, they are in reality a vast collection of documents accumulated over nearly 2,000 years. Letters, diplomatic correspondence, theological debates, legal records, and administrative texts fill countless shelves. Much of this material is mundane, technical, or deeply specific to its time. Yet the sheer scale of the archive, combined with restricted access, has fueled endless speculation. Restrictions exist for practical reasons. Ancient documents are fragile. Many are written in languages few can read. Others involve sensitive historical contexts requiring careful scholarship. Access is granted to qualified researchers, not withheld entirely. Still, to the outside observer, limitation can look like concealment. And where imagination fills the gaps, silence becomes suspicious. The association between the Vatican and secrecy is not entirely unfounded. Throughout history, discretion has been essential to its survival. As both a spiritual authority and a political entity, the Church has navigated wars, revolutions, and shifting powers. Silence at times was protection. Words spoken carelessly could inflame conflict or fracture belief. This culture of caution extends to how the Vatican engages with speculative claims. When ancient myths, like those of the Anunnaki, are recast as literal alternative histories, there is little incentive to respond. Addressing unsupported theories risks elevating them. Ignoring them allows them to fade. From a historical perspective, the Vatican has never claimed exclusive knowledge of ancient civilizations. It does not deny the existence of Mesopotamian gods. It simply places them firmly within the realm of mythology. To grant them more significance would require redefining theological boundaries that have remained stable for centuries. The idea that the Vatican fears the Anunnaki persists because it fits a compelling narrative. Powerful institution, hidden archives, ancient gods, suppressed truth. It is a modern myth, structured much like the ancient ones it references. It offers drama, mystery, and a sense of awakening. But like all myths, it reveals more about the storyteller than the subject. In reality, the Vatican's position is deeply conservative in the literal sense. It conserves, it preserves, it moves slowly. Change is measured, engagement is deliberate. Ideas that fall outside scholarly consensus are neither embraced nor aggressively rejected. They are simply not integrated. This approach can feel unsatisfying in a world that values immediacy and revelation. But institutions that have endured for centuries do so by resisting reaction. Silence, again, is not fear. It is patience. The Anunnaki, viewed through this lens, are not dangerous beings or forbidden knowledge. They are ancient stories that have been repurposed by modern imagination. The Church's refusal to engage with speculative interpretations is consistent with its long-standing approach to myth and history. As you listen, it may help to reframe the narrative. Instead of imagining locked rooms filled with cosmic secrets, imagine long corridors of parchment and ink. Documents recording debates about doctrine, disputes over land, letters between kings and popes. Human history, complex and ordinary, preserved in careful detail. The true power of the Vatican does not lie in hidden knowledge, but in narrative continuity. For nearly 2 millennia, it has told a coherent story about creation, meaning, and redemption. To protect that story, it must maintain clear boundaries. Ancient myths may exist beyond those boundaries, but they do not threaten what lies within. As the night grows quieter, the distinction becomes clear. The fear attributed to the Vatican is a projection. It is the fear of uncertainty, of competing origins, of the possibility that history is more complex than we prefer. Institutions do not fear this complexity. Individuals do. In the final part of this journey, we will step back from institutions and texts and consider the deeper reason these stories endure. We will explore why humans are drawn to hidden origins, why ancient gods continue to captivate modern minds, and how myth, belief, and psychology intertwine in the quiet spaces of thought. For now, allow the idea of secrecy to soften. What appears hidden is often simply distant. What seems forbidden is often misunderstood. And what feels dangerous may be nothing more than an echo from humanity's earliest attempts to understand the world. Long before institutions, before temples of stone, or archives of parchment, there was the human mind. It is here, in the quiet space between curiosity and fear, that myths are born. Every civilization, regardless of time or place, has looked up at the sky and wondered what lies beyond it. The stars have always invited stories. They are distant, silent, and eternal, offering just enough mystery to awaken imagination. The Anunnaki endure not because they were hidden, but because they speak to something ancient within us. They represent the idea that humanity was not alone at the beginning, that intelligence existed before us. That meaning was given rather than discovered. These themes appear again across cultures, wearing different names, different forms, but expressing the same underlying questions. Psychologically, origin stories serve a powerful function. They provide structure in a chaotic world. They explain suffering. They justify order. Ancient gods ruled floods, storms, fertility, and death, because early humans needed explanations for forces beyond their control. These gods were not distant abstractions. They were reflections of lived experience. As societies grew more complex, so did their myths. Gods formed councils. Authority became hierarchical. Creation became deliberate. These narratives mirrored human systems of governance. The Anunnaki, as a divine assembly, reflected the political reality of early city-states. Myth and society evolved together. When monotheistic belief systems emerged, the structure changed. A single god replaced the council. Unity replaced plurality. This shift brought clarity and stability, but it also narrowed the narrative. Alternative explanations became unnecessary, then unacceptable. What was once one story among many became the story. Yet the human mind does not easily release abandoned narratives. Suppressed or forgotten myths often return in new forms. When ancient texts were rediscovered, they did not re-enter a neutral space. They entered a world shaped by science, skepticism, and a growing distance from institutional authority. In this environment, old gods were reimagined through modern frameworks. The idea that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings reflects contemporary fascination with space and technology. Where ancient people saw divine realms, modern minds see other planets. Where myth once explained the unknown, science fiction now fills the gap. The language changes, but the impulse remains the same. Belief in hidden knowledge offers comfort. It suggests that confusion is intentional, not accidental. That someone, somewhere, understands the truth. In uncertain times, this idea can feel stabilizing. It transforms randomness into design, ignorance into exclusion. Institutions like the Vatican become symbols within this psychological landscape. They are old, they are quiet, they are authoritative. It is easy to imagine them as keepers of secrets, even when evidence suggests otherwise. The myth of concealment satisfies a desire for depth and drama that ordinary explanations lack. But history is rarely dramatic in the way stories suggest. It is slow, fragmented, incomplete. Much has been lost not through suppression, but through neglect, disaster, and time. Libraries burned, languages disappeared, civilizations collapsed. What survived did so by chance as much as intention. The enduring fascination with the Anunnaki is less about what they were and more about what they represent. They symbolize the possibility that our understanding of the past is incomplete, that beneath accepted narratives lie older layers of meaning. This possibility is not threatening. It is human. When viewed calmly, without urgency or fear, ancient myths become gentle companions. They remind us that we are part of a long continuum of thought, that the questions we ask today are echoes of questions asked thousands of years ago, and that uncertainty is not a failure of knowledge, but its beginning. As sleep approaches, it may help to release the need for definitive answers. History does not offer them. It offers fragments, patterns, and interpretations. The Anunnaki are one such fragment. They do not demand belief. They invite reflection. In the final moments of this journey, we will allow the story to settle, not with revelation or conclusion, but with quiet acceptance. The past does not need to be solved. It needs to be understood gently on its own terms. Let your thoughts slow. Let the ancient questions drift without urgency. The night is not a time for certainty, but for rest. And in that rest, history becomes what it has always been, a soft echo fading into the silence from which it came. As the story draws to a close, it becomes clear that history does not end with answers. It ends with perspective. The Anunnaki, the Vatican, ancient myths, modern interpretations, and human imagination are not opposing forces, but parts of the same long narrative. A narrative shaped by fear and wonder, certainty and doubt, silence and belief. The ancient gods of Mesopotamia were never meant to survive into the modern world as literal beings. They were expressions of a time when the universe felt alive and unpredictable, when the sky spoke through storms and the earth answered through floods. The Anunnaki were not rulers of humanity in a hidden sense, but reflections of humanity's earliest attempt to understand order in chaos. The Vatican, in contrast, represents something very different. It stands for continuity, for a belief system that sought to bring unity where once there was fragmentation. Its caution, its silence, and its resistance to speculation are not signs of fear, but of preservation. Institutions endure not by reacting to every new interpretation, but by maintaining stable meaning across generations. Between these two worlds lies the human mind, always searching, always questioning, always filling silence with stories. When ancient texts re-emerge, they do not return to the past. They enter the present, shaped by modern hopes and anxieties. In this process, myth becomes mystery and history becomes speculation. There is no hidden war between the Vatican and the Anunnaki. There is no buried truth waiting to overturn everything we know. What exists instead is something quieter and far more human. A long tradition of storytelling, a deep need to belong to something ancient, and a desire to believe that meaning was given, not accidental. History does not hide itself deliberately. It fades, it breaks, it forgets. What survives does so imperfectly. Clay tablets crack, manuscripts decay, languages vanish. What we reconstruct is always incomplete, and within those gaps, imagination naturally grows. The Anunnaki live in those gaps now, not as gods, not as visitors from the stars, but as symbols of humanity's earliest questions. Who made us, why we exist, and whether we are alone in the vastness of the universe. Religion, myth, and psychology all emerge from the same source. The awareness of mortality, the experience of uncertainty, the hope that existence has purpose beyond survival. These forces do not compete. They overlap. They shape each other quietly over centuries. As you rest, there is no need to decide what to believe. The ancient world does not demand loyalty. The modern world does not require rejection. Both can exist gently, side by side, as parts of a long human conversation. The Vatican will continue to preserve its doctrine. Scholars will continue to study ancient texts. Myths will continue to be retold in new forms. And humanity will continue to look backward in order to understand itself. There is peace in accepting that some stories are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be remembered, felt, and then allowed to fade into silence. Let the rivers of Mesopotamia flow once more through your thoughts. Let the stone walls of ancient temples stand quietly in the distance. Let the libraries, archives, and forgotten languages rest where they belong, not as sources of fear, but as witnesses to humanity's long journey. As the night deepens, history becomes softer. Edges blur, meanings loosen. What remains is a sense of continuity, that you are part of something far older than any institution, any myth, or any belief system. And in that understanding there is rest. Allow your thoughts to slow now. The questions can wait, the stories have been told, and the past, at last, is quiet. As time continues to stretch quietly forward, history begins to feel less like a sequence of events and more like a distant landscape. Details soften, edges blur. The urgency to explain fades away, replaced by a gentle awareness that the past does not demand resolution. It simply exists, layered beneath the present, steady and unmoving. In this space, the stories of ancient gods, sacred institutions, and human belief lose their weight and become something lighter, something almost peaceful. The Anunnaki, once spoken of with reverence in the cities of Sumer, were never meant to survive as fixed truths. Their stories lived in a world without certainty, where the rhythms of nature shaped belief more than logic ever could. Floods arrived without warning. Crops failed or flourished beyond expectation. The sky burned with unfamiliar lights. In such a world, gods were not distant ideas. They were explanations that made life bearable. Those who pressed symbols into clay did not imagine a future where their words would be studied under electric lights. They wrote for their own time, for their own fears and hopes. They wrote to give shape to forces they could not control. And when their civilizations faded, those stories did not disappear out of intention, but out of silence. The earth closed over them. Time moved on. Centuries later, when those stories were uncovered, they returned without context. Their world was gone. Their language had died. What remained were fragments, incomplete and open to interpretation. And into those gaps, modern imagination quietly stepped. This is how myths are reborn. Not as they were, but as reflections of the era that rediscovers them. Where ancient people saw divine authority, modern minds sometimes see advanced intelligence. Where temples once stood, theories now rise. The Anunnaki became mirrors, reflecting contemporary questions more than ancient answers. The Vatican, too, occupies this reflective space. It exists not only as a physical place, but as an idea shaped by centuries of continuity. Its rituals move slowly. Its language is careful. It does not rush to respond, because it was never designed for speed. In a world that changes rapidly, stillness can appear suspicious. But stillness is not concealment. Silence is not fear. Often is simply the result of time moving at a different pace. Institutions that last for centuries learn that reacting to every new idea weakens structure. They endure by choosing what to engage with and what to allow to pass. This restraint has been misunderstood as secrecy when it is more accurately described as distance. The distance between ancient myth and modern belief feels vast, yet it is bridged by something simple and deeply human. Curiosity, the desire to know where we came from, the hope that our existence is part of a larger story. These desires do not disappear with knowledge. They persist even as explanations improve. Science answers many questions, but it does not replace wonder. Religion offers meaning, but it does not erase doubt. Myth fills the spaces in between, quietly and persistently. The Anunnaki occupy one of those spaces now, not as creators or rulers, but as reminders. Reminders that humanity has always imagined itself in relation to something greater. Whether that greatness took the form of gods, nature, or the cosmos depended on the language of the time. As night deepens, it becomes easier to let go of certainty. The need to decide what is true loosens its grip. History does not require belief. It asks only for attention, and even that gently. Think of how many stories have been told and forgotten. How many gods once ruled the world in the minds of those who believed in them completely? Each was real in its time. Each shaped lives, laws, and rituals. And then, slowly they faded, not defeated, but replaced. This cycle is not tragic. It is natural. Belief evolves because humanity evolves. Each era inherits the questions of the last and answers them differently. No answer lasts forever, and no story truly dies. The clay tablets remain, the archives remain, the myths remain, but they no longer demand allegiance. They rest, waiting to be studied, reimagined, or simply remembered. In this quiet moment, there is no conflict between ancient gods and modern faith, no struggle between secrecy and revelation. These tensions exist only when urgency is applied to what is inherently slow. History moves at the pace of erosion, not explosion. It reshapes meaning grain by grain, century by century. As you listen, your role is not to judge or decide. It is to observe gently, to allow stories to pass through your thoughts without resistance, to recognize that uncertainty is not a flaw, but a constant companion to understanding. The human mind seeks patterns even when none are required. It connects dots, fills silence, and assigns intention where chance may suffice. This instinct once created gods. It now creates theories. The form changes, but the instinct remains. And that instinct is not dangerous, it is creative. It is how art, philosophy, religion, and science began. It is how meaning is shaped. As sleep approaches, these ideas no longer need structure. They can drift freely, unbound by explanation. The past becomes distant, the future irrelevant. Only the present moment remains, calm and unburdened. Imagine the world before names, before gods, before institutions. Just sky, earth, and time. Humanity would come later. Stories later still. Everything you have heard tonight is built upon that silence, and that silence remains beneath it all. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts lose form. The Anunnaki no longer need interpretation. The Vatican no longer needs explanation. They dissolve into the broader flow of human memory. Nothing is hidden from you. Nothing is required of you. You're allowed to rest without answers. The night does not ask questions. It offers rest. As the hours continue to pass, the weight of history grows lighter. What once felt vast and complex now settles into something simpler, something easier to hold. The past no longer presses for understanding. It drifts, like distant clouds moving slowly across a night sky, present but unconcerned with attention. Humanity has always lived surrounded by what it does not know. Long before language was written, long before gods were named, people sensed the world moving around them in ways they could not control. The wind came and went. The rivers rose and fell. The stars appeared and disappeared with quiet precision. Meaning was not explained. It was felt. From that feeling came stories. Not as facts, but as companions. Stories made the darkness less empty. They gave shape to fear and beauty alike. In the earliest civilizations, gods were not distant rulers. They were part of daily life. They explained why the earth trembled, why crops failed, why kings ruled. They gave reason to survival. The Anunnaki belonged to that moment in human thought. They were not hidden nor secretive. They were openly spoken of, honoured and feared. Their stories were shared aloud, sung in hymns, carved into stone. They existed because they made sense in their time, and then, as time always does, it moved on. Civilizations faded. Languages fell silent. Names lost meaning. What was once sacred became unreadable. The gods did not vanish in fire or conflict. They simply stopped being spoken. And in that silence they rested. When they returned, thousands of years later, it was into a very different world. A world shaped by institutions, doctrines, and systems of belief that valued consistency and permanence. A world where meaning had become structured, organised, and defended. This contrast often creates tension in the modern imagination. Ancient belief feels fluid and poetic. Modern belief feels fixed and guarded. When the two meet, misunderstanding arises. The Vatican is often placed at the centre of this misunderstanding. It represents stability in a way few institutions can. Its traditions are slow. Its language deliberate. It does not shift easily, because it was never meant to. It exists to preserve meaning, not to chase interpretation. This preservation can feel distant, and distance can feel like concealment. But preservation and secrecy are not the same. One protects what exists. The other hides what threatens. The Vatican has never needed to hide ancient gods, because ancient gods do not threaten its foundations. They belong to a different chapter of human belief. What unsettles modern audiences is not ancient mythology, but uncertainty. The idea that our understanding of the past is incomplete, that beneath familiar narratives lie older ones, stranger ones, shaped by minds unlike our own. This discomfort is natural. Humans seek coherence. We want history to move in clean lines. We want origins to be clear. We want meaning to be stable. But history resists this. It is fragmented, uneven, filled with loss. Most of what humanity had ever known is gone, not hidden. Gone. Libraries burned. Cities collapsed. Knowledge vanished with the people who carried it. What remains is accidental, incomplete, and precious. It survives not because it was chosen, but because it endured. The Anunnaki survived in fragments. The Vatican survived in continuity. Both exist now not as rivals, but as symbols of different ways humanity relates to time. Ancient myth looks backward through imagination. Institutional belief looks backward through doctrine. Both are attempts to anchor meaning in a world that never stops changing. As sleep approaches, these distinctions lose importance. The mind no longer needs to categorize. Stories blend together, softened by fatigue and quiet. You do not need to resolve the past tonight. You do not need to decide what matters or what does not. History will remain, whether you watch it closely or let it drift. Think of how many generations have lived and rested before you. How many people lay beneath the same sky, carrying their own questions into sleep? Some believed in many gods. Some believed in one. Some believed in none at all. All of them dreamed. Their thoughts faded. Their certainties dissolved. What remained was rest. This is the rhythm of humanity. Wake, wonder, Sleep. The stories you have heard are part of that rhythm. They are not demands, they are echoes. The Anunnaki do not ask to be believed. The Vatican does not ask to be feared. Both are part of humanity's long attempt to understand itself. As your breathing slows, allow the layers of history to settle. Imagine them stacking gently, one atop another, forming a quiet foundation beneath the present moment. You do not need to dig into it. You can simply rest upon it. The night accepts uncertainty. It does not require explanation. In darkness, clarity becomes less important than comfort. Let the ancient rivers flow again, softly, without direction. Let stone temples and high walls stand quietly in the distance. Let books close themselves. Let questions remain unanswered. Nothing is unresolved, nothing is missing. Everything is where it belongs. Sleep does not erase thought. It releases it. And in that release, history becomes gentle. As the night continues to stretch quietly onward, the world feels more distant, as though history itself has stepped back to allow silence to take its place. The mind, no longer pressed by the need to understand, begins to wander gently through time without effort. The past becomes less a collection of events and more a feeling, a slow-moving presence that exists without urgency. Human memory works this way. It does not preserve everything equally. Some moments are sharp. Others dissolve almost immediately. Civilizations behave much the same. They remember what they repeat and forget what they no longer speak aloud. The Anunnaki were once repeated endlessly. Their names echoed through temples and ceremonies. They shaped how people understood authority, creation and fate, and then, gradually, those names were spoken less often, until silence took their place. Silence is not destruction. It is simply absence of sound. The clay tablets remained where they were left, buried, unnoticed, waiting without intention. Time passed without concern for meaning. Much later, when those tablets were uncovered, they entered a world already filled with explanation. A world that believed it understood itself. Ancient stories, when rediscovered, do not arrive gently. They disrupt assumptions. They remind us that what feels permanent is often temporary. This disruption is rarely comfortable. It invites doubt. It raises questions about continuity. It suggests that humanity has rewritten its understanding of existence many times before, and will likely do so again. Institutions, especially ancient ones, are shaped by an awareness of this fragility. The Vatican, like any structure that has survived for centuries, is built around preservation. Its role has never been to chase every reinterpretation of history, but to maintain a stable framework through which meaning can endure. This stability can feel rigid to modern sensibilities. We live in an age that values revision, challenge, and exposure. Silence feels unnatural. Distance feels suspicious. But slowness is not weakness. It is a different relationship with time. The Vatican does not operate on the scale of individual curiosity. It operates on the scale of centuries. Ideas are not adopted quickly because they are compelling. They are examined, contextualized, and often left aside if they do not serve the larger structure of belief. Ancient Mesopotamian mythology does not threaten that structure. It exists outside it. It belongs to a time before Christian theology, before doctrinal unity, before the idea of a singular narrative governing existence. It is not rejected. It is simply placed where it belongs. The modern fascination with hidden knowledge often misunderstands this placement. When something is not actively discussed, it is assumed to be suppressed. When an institution remains quiet, it is assumed to be afraid. But often, quiet is simply the absence of necessity. Fear is reactive. Silence is selective. The Anunnaki occupy a place that does not require reaction. They are not present in doctrine. They do not appear in theology. They do not challenge belief because they are understood, historically, as mythology. Their power exists only in reinterpretation. Reinterpretation is a uniquely human activity. It allows old ideas to feel new again. It reshapes fragments into patterns. It transforms metaphor into speculation. This process is not malicious. It is creative. In the modern world, creativity often seeks mystery. The unknown feels more meaningful than the explained. The idea that something has been hidden feels more satisfying than the idea that it was simply lost. But loss is the dominant force of history. Most of what humanity has thought, believed, and built has vanished. Entire belief systems disappeared without conflict. Entire languages ceased to exist. The Anunnaki were not erased, they were forgotten. And forgetting is far more common than suppression. As fatigue settles in, this realization becomes calming rather than unsettling. Nothing is required to persist forever. Not ideas, not institutions, not even certainty. Belief systems rise to meet the needs of their time. When those needs change, belief adapts. This does not mean earlier beliefs were false. It means they were contextual. The Anunnaki were true to the world that created them. Christianity was true to the world that followed. Modern skepticism is true to the world that questions both. None cancel the others. They exist as layers, not replacements. The mind often seeks a single origin, one explanation that stands above all others. But history resists singularity. It unfolds through accumulation. As you rest, imagine time not as a line, but as a deep ocean. Near the surface, waves move quickly. Trends rise and fall. Beneath that, currents move slowly. And far below, stillness remains unchanged for millennia. The Anunnaki rest in those depths, so does humanity's fear of nature. So does the instinct to assign agency to the unknown. These things do not vanish, they settle. The Vatican rests in a different layer, built not on myth, but on continuity. Its role is not to explore every depth, but to remain anchored. Anchors do not move often, they are not designed to. This difference creates misunderstanding. One side moves through imagination, the other through preservation. Both are human responses to uncertainty. As sleep approaches, there is no need to choose between them. The mind can allow both to exist without conflict. Ancient gods can remain ancient. Institutions can remain slow, and curiosity can remain unsatisfied without discomfort. The night does not demand answers, it accepts ambiguity. In darkness, certainty loses importance. Let your thoughts slow further now. Let stories loosen their grip. Names fade, concepts dissolve. What remains is the steady rhythm of time passing without explanation. History continues whether we interpret it or not. Meaning continues whether we define it or not. And rest arrives whether questions are answered or left open. You are not required to understand the past to belong to it. The silence now is enough. As the night deepens further, thought itself begins to slow. The mind no longer moves in sharp lines, but in wide, gentle arcs. Ideas blend softly into one another, losing their urgency and their edges. History, once heavy with meaning, becomes something almost weightless, like a distant memory that no longer needs to be recalled clearly in order to exist. There is a quiet comfort in realizing how little of the past demands our attention. Most of it unfolds without witnesses. Entire lifetimes pass unnoticed. Entire generations live, believe, and fade without leaving more than a trace. What survives does so not because it was destined, but because it happened to endure. The Anunnaki endured in fragments. The Vatican endured in structure. Both are rare outcomes in a world where forgetting is the norm. Ancient Mesopotamians did not imagine themselves as the beginning of history. They believed they were continuing something older still. Their gods had ancestors. Their myths referenced ages before memory. Even at the dawn of writing, humanity already sensed that it stood in the middle of a much longer story. That awareness never left us. Every culture that followed inherited the same intuition, that the present moment is temporary. That meaning stretches backwards and forwards beyond individual lives. Religion, myth, and philosophy all grew from this shared realization. When Christianity rose, it did not erase this instinct. It reshaped it. Time gained direction. History gained purpose. Creation was no longer cyclical, but intentional. The past led toward something. The future held fulfillment. This linear vision brought stability to vast populations. It organized belief, morality, and hope. It allowed institutions like the Vatican to endure by anchoring, meaning to continuity rather than reinvention. But beneath that structure, the older human instincts remained. The instinct to imagine forgotten origins. The instinct to wonder whether something older still lies beneath accepted narratives. The instinct to believe that silence conceals depth. These instincts are not enemies of belief. They are its roots. The fascination with the Anunnaki emerges from this place, not from evidence or rebellion, but from curiosity shaped by distance. The farther something is removed from us, the easier it becomes to imagine it as extraordinary. Ancient gods feel powerful because they no longer belong to anyone. They are not defended. They are not practiced. They are free to become whatever the imagination needs them to be. Institutions, by contrast, feel heavy because they persist. They define boundaries. They maintain consistency. They resist reinterpretation. In doing so, they attract suspicion from minds accustomed to fluidity. Yet persistence is not dominance. It is endurance. The Vatican's longevity does not imply control over all history. It implies focus. Its attention has always been inward, toward doctrine, tradition, and internal coherence. What lies beyond those boundaries is acknowledged, but not absorbed. Ancient Mesopotamian myths lie far beyond those boundaries. They are studied by historians, linguists, and archaeologists, not by theologians seeking revelation. Their role is descriptive, not prescriptive. This distinction matters, though it is often overlooked. The Church does not engage with the Anunnaki because there is nothing to engage with. Myth does not argue. It exists. Conflict arises only when myth is reframed as hidden truth. The human mind loves this reframing. It transforms passivity into purpose. It suggests that confusion is intentional, that silence is meaningful, that absence is deliberate, but most of history is unintentional. It unfolds through chance, loss, and survival. The clay tablets survived because they were buried. The Vatican survived because it adapted. Neither outcome was planned in advance. Both were shaped by circumstance. As sleep draws closer, this realization becomes soothing. There is no hidden struggle guiding history. No secret hand shaping belief behind closed doors. Only humans responding to the conditions of their time. Those conditions change. Belief follows. What feels mysterious now will feel ordinary later. What feels permanent now will one day feel distant. This has always been true. The gods of ancient Egypt once ruled eternity. Now they reside in museums. The gods of Greece once shaped empires. Now they live in literature. The Anunnaki once defined cosmic order. Now they live in interpretation. None were defeated, they were outgrown, and what exists today will one day join them. This is not loss, it is continuity of a different kind. As the mind loosens its grip on explanation, history becomes something to drift through rather than analyse. Events slow. Narratives dissolve. Meaning softens. You do not need to hold on to names or dates. They can fade safely. The essence remains. The essence is simple. Humanity has always sought meaning. When one explanation no longer fits, another takes its place. This process is not deception, it is adaptation. Institutions resist rapid change because they value stability. Individuals seek novelty because they value understanding. Neither impulse is wrong, they exist in balance. The night understands this balance intuitively. It does not demand motion or stillness. It allows both. As your thoughts grow quieter, allow the long arc of history to stretch beyond concern. You are not responsible for interpreting it. You are part of it simply by existing. Countless lives have rested before you. Countless questions have gone unanswered without harm. The world continued. It will continue now, whether you think about it or not. Let the Anunnaki rest in the past where they belong. Let institutions rest in their time. Let curiosity rest without resolution. The present moment does not require explanation, only rest. Let your breathing slow further. Let thought thin into silence. The story no longer needs words. Sleep arrives gently when nothing is asked of it. And now, nothing is.